Welcome to the 17th Platypus International Convention, Is There a Left in the 21st Century? This is our closing plenary, which takes the same title. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 1960s to 70s, and post-political 1980s to 90s left. For the possibilities of emancipatory politics today, we are located on campuses all around the world, and this convention is hosted by our University of Chicago chapter, which meets for reading groups every Tuesday at 6:30 p.m. in Harbor 151, and coffee breaks every Friday at 4:30 p.m. in Pret a Manger. Hayes and Vichy are the leaders of our Chicago chapter, and if you want to get involved, you can talk to them after the panel. So I'm going to read the panel description for our closing plenary, Is There a Left in the 21st Century? And then I'll introduce the panelists. The millennial generation inaugurated the 21st century with anti-imperialism, anti-globalization, and social democratic politics. In doing so, they also replayed, advocated, and tried to cast aside the politics of the 20th century. How the millennial left related to the 20th century informs the conditions for a left adequate to the 21st century. What was the millennial left? Did the millennial left try to overcome the 20th century? If so, how? If not, what would it mean to do so? Did the 20th century ever end? Or does the 21st century pose new terrain for emancipatory politics? How have historical conditions changed from 2015 to 2025? How has the left changed? Looking back, how do we write a history of the last 25 years? In what ways was the left successful, if at all? What obstacles prevented its success, if it failed? Looking forward, if change, once again, is coming from the right, how does the failure of the millennial left to overcome capitalism inform a potential left for the 21st century? And finally, is there a left in the 21st century? And if so, what is its task? So I will introduce our panelists in the order in which they'll speak. Alex Higgins, almost at the very end of the table, not quite, is an editor of Prometheus Journal. Bronco Marcetic is a Jacobin staff writer and the author of Yesterday's Man, The Case Against Joe Biden. Andrew Hartman is professor of history at Illinois State University, where he teaches courses in U.S. intellectual, cultural, and political history. He is the author of the forthcoming Marx in America, to be published this May 2025. And Chris Cutrone is a professor at the Art Institute of Chicago and the original founder and the organizer of the Platypus Affiliated Society. He is the author of Death of the Millennial Left and Marxism in Politics. So the panelists will give us opening remarks, followed by a short round of responses, and then we'll turn to the audience for Q&A. So Alex, if you'd like to begin, thank you.
Okay, how's that? Is that right? Yeah, I wanted to kick off by expressing mine and the Prometheus Board's solidarity with the Palestinian people and with Palestinian resistance to oppression, apartheid, and genocide, and our opposition to US imperialism and Trump's plan for Gaza, which is one of the cool things that we've been speaking about in our context. So yeah, 4 years ago, I was involved in a protest against an Israeli arms factory. It was a subsidiary of Elbit Systems, you might have heard of, that produced drones for the Israeli military and various other oppressive regimes across the world. And as a result, I found myself sitting in a police cell, eating a pot noodle with what I kind of realized was an anti-suicide fork, or maybe it was so I can stab someone else with it, I don't know, special fork. And we were discharged from the jail in the early hours of the morning without our clothes, without our shoes, and so prison issued clothes, and had to drive back from Stafford to London, 3.5 hours. So to put that in US terms, that's like you waking up in police custody in the Yukon Delta and having to drive home. So the reason I say this, I see these experiences I've accumulated sort of muddling what it means to sort of take political action and doing stupid things and doing some less stupid things. And for me, I've always understood if someone asks me, you know, how did that end up happening, or why did you do that stupid thing, it's because I'm on the left. That's always been how I've justified it to myself and to other people. So, like on an instinctive level, as someone that's previously not familiar with extensively with Platypus's critique, question: is there a left? Questions like that, I sort of respond with a bit of confusion and maybe indignation. But on further thought, I found there's something really useful in this question, and I think it resonates a lot with what we're trying to do at Prometheus, especially its implication that perhaps the left does not quite exist. So as I understand it, the origins of the term the left comes from the Revolutionary National Assembly of 1789, and this was composed only of the third estate, or the commons, which George Lefebvre describes as every commoner from the wealthiest bourgeois to the poorest beggar. In other words, these were the revolutionary classes, not the aristocracy, and the left was the radical section within this class bloc. And this sort of rough history, I find, is sort of tells us some important things about the question posed today. What left tendency is, and what it means for a political tendency to be or to exist, which is what I'm going to try and discuss. Firstly, to be identified as a left politically, we must be the left of the revolutionary movement against the incumbent political and economic regime. In our context, the left of the working class socialist movement. This title, therefore, can only be claimed by a movement that is of the working class and that has a program which seeks to overturn the capitalist regime, our equivalent of the old regime, and importantly, which is disloyal to the state. And this made me reflect on our experience in Britain in 2015 to 2020 with the Corbyn movement. And to most of society, this iteration of the Labour Party was firmly on the left in society and in Parliament, and in a sense, but it, on reflection, lacked any kind of serious conception of the role of the state in upholding the capitalist status quo. So there was some attempts to address this. The late Leo Panich wrote and spoke about the challenges that we should anticipate on entry into government, but it was sort of too little, too late. And this includes, the obvious level, the state's repressive apparatus. This is hopefully the only time I repeat myself. I said this earlier, but we included in our manifesto 10,000 more police. But more deeply, we didn't understand the role that particularly the civil service and the state bureaucracy played. And we didn't conceive of the need to sort of theorize how to replace existing institutions and routines of the parliamentary tradition with more radically democratic forms. Sure, we shied away from these constitutional questions as sort of treating them as secondary in pursuit of our immediate aims. So moving forward, to be the left in society, I think we need to theorize these things in advance and incorporate them into a program for overturning the regime itself into a system for working class political rule. And therefore, to me, the only left that we should be thinking about and identifying with is what gets called the far left, or the communist left. But obviously, the far left exists in the same sense that I might say I'm on the left, or someone might think they're on the left. We know we exist. But the example of 1789 also tells us something about what it means for a political tendency to meaningfully exist in society. So in their case, they made up a significant portion of elected representatives, but that doesn't mean that the left, to exist, the left must hold half of all the seats in the legislature, but it must constitute in some way a real force in society. It must be a tangible presence in people's lives. And this is a problem the far left runs into. So our movements and sects and groups, some call themselves parties, have little influence in society and content themselves with campaigning at this sort of sharp edge of exploitation and oppression. And at Prometheus, we think this is vitally important to do, of course, but it isn't enough. And I think we can think about how this relates to the collapse of the daily newspaper in recent decades. As a sort of general thing, as something that's really badly affected the left. The far left has been unable to realize an alternative means of permeating popular consciousness and making its propaganda felt in society since its development. So the newspaper obviously was never a silver bullet, but it formed the scaffolding for political organization, and it was how the left extended its arguments and its interpretations of events beyond its sort of immediate circles. So this is something I think we need to think through, overcoming this kind of impasse that we face, and this is one aspect of how the left, overcoming this is one aspect of how the left can become, can be again. And I just wanted to also sort of qualify this, say something in the other direction. We want to avoid being caught in the hamster wheel of sort of movementist activism, which can be kind of exhausting and become extremely absorbed in it. But nevertheless, the left must be at the forefront of opposing exploitation and oppression of all kinds, ideologically and materially. And this means actively engaging in the labor movement, of course, but also fighting against racism, transphobia, anti-migrant sentiment. And the practical struggle around these issues necessarily concerns a kind of closed circle. But the left and its counter-propaganda can and should serve as a circulator of these struggles, making the whole class aware of them and aware of how these oppressions play a role in the maintenance of exploitation and domination for the whole class. And this is the other reason I shared this anecdote at the beginning. Whilst maintaining critique and institutions like this, in which we can debate this critique, the left must continue to get its hands dirty, in my opinion, and engage in the struggles of its time. And this is where I might, slightly criticize my impression of how Platypus is. But on the other hand, I think the left would benefit greatly from reflecting in the way that Platypus does, and analyzing past movements, instead of doing what tends to happen, which is sort of pivoting on to the next thing and pretending that what happened didn't happen, pretending that these past failures just didn't happen. So maybe when viewed dispassionately in a certain sense, the left may not exist. I'm willing to accept that. As individuals, we might identify with and sort of see our lives as being shaped by being on the left. We may even be part of a community of like-minded people. But this is not enough. This doesn't mean that we have the necessary weapons at our disposal for the struggle against capitalism. But I don't think this should be a council of despair, but a rallying cry to resurrect this revolutionary and democratic spirit, which is the left, and to spread it far and wide.
Hello. Yes, it's working. First of all, I want to apologize for coming late. When you get on the bus, always make sure that's the bus going on the right way that you turn up. It's a very good lesson for everyone. Yeah, is there a left in the 21st century? The answer to that question is I would say yes. I think the much better question is, if we look at the fact that, look at opinion polls, look at even political rhetoric in the United States, look at the way that even reactionary politicians like Trump at least feel the need to pay lip service to things like protecting programs like Social Security and other entitlements. Why is it, if it seems like the left has won the argument and so an intellectual level, trade as well. We can talk about. We can also look at people's attitudes broadly in terms of things like women's rights and racism and so forth. The left has won those arguments on the whole, and yet the left is still marginalized and really has very little influence over politics in the United States and in a lot of other countries. And I think that's a big question. I think there are a million outside obstacles that we can point to that are always going to be there, whether state repression or the fact that the right is just far better resourced. I mean, the amount of money on the right is hard to really properly comprehend. I think it was Stephen Crowder, he got paid a contract of $50 million by Ben Shapiro's outfit to do whatever he was doing. That's an NBA level contract. Nothing like that even exists. Jacobin, I can only dream of us getting $50 million over the course of decades, over a few years. So, all these things are going to be always true. It's always going to be true that there's going to be a liberal establishment or, a sort of center-left party establishment that doesn't want to work with the left, that wants to marginalize it, wants to keep it out of power. So we could point to all those things, and I think those are all legitimate to point to. I think we also need to have a little bit of self-reflection on the left. And there are, a number of things that you could point to, mistakes that have been made over the past, let's say, 10 years, if we think about this most recent upsurge in kind of left-wing organizing. This is maybe not a particularly cutting-edge criticism, but it is true that the makeup of the current left as it exists is still and has been weighted towards, for the most part, downwardly mobile, younger, formerly middle-class people. There is still a disconnect between a broader working class and actual left organizing. That's not a new problem, but that is one that needs to be solved, and I think it's one that left organizers struggle with pretty consistently, but I'm not sure that it has really been something that has been overcome. As a result of that kind of class or demographic makeup, I think that the left has, for a long time, kind of failed to be able to effectively communicate with the very people that it's trying to win over, that's trying to organize. Much has been made about about college education being a kind of fault line that divides this, and I think that is true, not because it's bad to have a college education, it's bad to be educated, it's not at all, it's very good, but it does mean that if you are unable to, if that's the kind of communication style, discursive style that you use, it may be difficult if you don't have roots within the working class communities that you're trying to speak to. It may be difficult for you to engage with them and do the actual difficult part of organizing. I think that is a bit of a perennial problem, still something that needs to be gotten over. I think the Biden years were a bit of an interesting experiment in terms of the left was not in power, but here you had kind of a nominally social, democratic-minded president that seemed friendly or open to certain left-wing ideas, and how would the left relate to that? I think everyone was making it up as they went along. No one totally knew how this would work. I think ultimately, I think looking back at it, we can say that probably too much of an accommodationist position was made with the Biden administration that certainly was open and had bought some of the left's arguments, but ultimately still needed to be pushed to go further, and ultimately I think saw more kind of utility in co-opting some of these movements and kind of making them irrelevant, which now we look back and we say, that was a big mistake, because the Biden years ultimately did not really produce all that much in terms of actual policy accomplishments. I think there are certain distinct strategic mistakes. I really believe that the way that not all segments, but some segments of the left, very vocal, very passionate segments of the left, went towards unfortunately, a very gung-ho, kind of pro-war position as regards to the Ukraine conflict. I think maybe it's not being realized now. I think in some years that will be looked back on as a really fatal mistake. It was understandable because obviously that was a horrific conflict that these people were being murdered and abused and all manner of things by an invading force. But I think the failure to actually take the position that much of the left has taken on the Gaza issue, which is not to call for sort of endless war in the hope of ultimate victory, but to call for a ceasefire, negotiations, or some kind of negotiated settlement. I think that would have been the better option. And why this is relevant to the left is the result of that war being prolonged, 2022 and beyond, led to, number one, it allowed the right to come in and present themselves as a kind of peaceniks. They were able to take this anti-war mantle, and that's happened not just in the United States, where Trump did that very effectively versus Kamala Harris, but it's happened in places like Germany too, and other countries. I think that was one problem. The other problem is that the Ukraine war and its prolonging set off this, inflation was happening already, but it really turbocharged inflation, particularly in Europe, and the resulting increase in poverty, the general increase in hardship for people in Europe, but also in the United States, has in some cases provided an opening for far-right parties and movements to come in. In some cases it's destabilized governments. That has also allowed far-right parties to try and win power, and they've succeeded. And that's happened everywhere. That it has been probably the fuel, the greatest fuel for the rise of, whatever you want to call it, neo-fascism or a resurgent far-right or a kind of, ultra-nationalist, hyper-nativist movement like Trump's. We could go through other failures, but I think those are some big ones. But I would be remiss to just give a very gloomy outlook on everything, because even though I think the left has not really, been as successful as I would have liked to have seen, or I'm sure most anyone here would like to have seen, especially if we're looking at Trump disbanding the federal government right now. I think there have been successes. I think that if you look at, in the United States, if you look at the state level, there's been a tremendous amount of legislation passed that was not even on the table a decade ago, and that was entirely because the left have been able to change the kind of argument, have been able to change the discourse, have been able to put certain things onto the table that weren't on a table. If you think about a lot of the progressive victories in Minnesota, for instance, where you had paid sick leave and a ban on non-complete clauses and all manner of other things. State legislation in New York in favor of tenants and the sort of a green transition bill that was passed and we could point to the $15 minimum wage becoming the law by ballot measure all over the country. These are direct outcomes of a lot of what the left has been doing for the last 10 years. This may be controversial, but I actually see a lot of the stuff that happened in the COVID. Yes, the lockdowns were very unpleasant and terrible and everything, but in terms of the economic support that was provided to people to get them through that crisis, that was a massive victory, and it happened under a far-right president, who now has gone in very, very far to the neoliberal right. But in that moment in 2020, he, as Trump had said, he said, the left is going to be very difficult to beat in this election. So what did he do? He listened to a lot of what the left was saying and what either left-wing elected officials or left-wing activists were saying, and he said, yeah, these are some good ideas that I can use to try and make people's lives a little worse so they don't vote me out in a few months. And so you had some pretty drastic things happen in that year, like an eviction ban, which is a pretty radical idea, especially using a decades-old law for kind of managing the government response to public health crises. It was a very obscure little provision, but they used that to enact an eviction ban that was ultimately struck down, but for that year and a half period really did a lot of good for people. Generally, the US welfare state saw the largest expansion it had seen in decades in this period. And again, it happened under a far-right president, and it happened with a neoliberal Democratic Party controlling Congress. And I think that is a direct result, yes, both the crisis, but also a lot of the things that the left had been pushing for. And I think, there's a lot of, in terms of some of the discussion of trade, war, and so on and so forth, foreign policy, I think a lot of the arguments that the left has made over the past 20-some years has started to break through and become something closer to common sense. The problem is it's still not there yet because the government institutions in the United States are completely unresponsive to democratic means. We effectively live in a dictatorship when it comes to foreign policy, and we live in an oligarchy when it comes to domestic policy. I think also looking outside of the United States, when you look at something like Morena in Mexico, this is a movement that didn't exist 15 years ago, and now it is dominating Mexican politics, and not just dominating Mexican politics, but has actually achieved a lot of victories on the policy level. It's lifted people out of poverty. It is transforming the politics in Mexico, and it is also one of the few places, one of the few parties, movements that has managed to reverse the process of class de-alignment, which basically every kind of left-wing movement and party around the world is struggling with. What I would, I guess, close with is that I think that I'm always, disappointed and wanting more from the left, and I think there's been many mistakes and setbacks coming from those mistakes, and we are not nearly where we have to be, and we have a very short amount of time to do it. But at the same time, you do not fight because you are guaranteed a win. You fight because there is no other option. And I think that is where we are right now. We have to learn from those mistakes and keep fighting and fight a lot better and smarter.
All right. So thanks for having me here. My opening comments are about the long history of the American left. I apologize in advance, I'm a historian, but I hope they'll generate some ways of thinking about the contemporary left. So over the last 10 years, I've been researching and writing a book, Karl Marx in America, and among other things, it seeks to answer two related questions. Why have Americans, especially on the left, but not just on the left, been grappling with Karl Marx since the late 19th century, to the present, what you might describe as from the first Gilded Age to our second current Gilded Age. Also, why have an underappreciated number of Americans turn to Marx as a guide or a sage or a prophet? I think in response to the prompts of today's panel, answers to these questions I think can also be answers to the recurrent questions. Is there an American left? Do we exist? And what can we say about the American left? So ever since the late 19th century, a subset of Americans have looked to Marx for wisdom. In fact, what I've discovered is that there are about 4 periods across US history in which these are periods I refer to as Marx booms. Lots of Americans read Marx, but not only lots of Americans read Marx, thought about Marx, wrote about Marx, they also read Marx favorably. So during the Gilded Age, socialists read Marx as the antidote to the unchecked power of the mighty corporation. They also read him as having the best answer to the labor question that plagued society at that time. Hailing from the North American, European, and Asian countrysides, a growing urban proletariat had nothing to sell but their labor. Rapidly expanding industries delivered lots of jobs, but never the type of jobs that would offer security, much less plenty. Indeed, the very presence of this urban proletariat enabled capitalists to press wages, and so cities became fertile grounds for poverty and its complications, crime and disease. I'm sure this is a history you're familiar with, but this is the larger labor question that plagued all realms of intellectual and political society in the late 19th and early 20th century. Lots of solutions were posed to the problem of the labor question, offered up by the populists, social gospelites, the growing labor movement, and more. Marx's ideas were in the mix in this context because he offered workers a theory of historical change that connected their personal struggles to larger historical and impersonal forces that were beyond their control. He also offered a rough blueprint for how they might improve their condition. So arguably, the most remembered aspect of Marx's thoughts on the working class is his notion that workers are destined to be the vanguard of revolutionary change. Once workers overthrow their bourgeois masters, the profit motive will no longer dictate social organization. Life will improve tremendously for everybody. But this strain of Marx's thought, which is a central element of the Communist Manifesto, was not what primarily drew American workers to Marx during the Gilded Age. Rather, they were much more attuned to the perhaps less ambitious but equally profound argument that Marx made in Capital, that capitalists profited by exploiting workers. That was the explanation for starvation wages. So by following Marx's logic from Capital, workers would vastly improve their condition by first unionizing, then leveraging their collective power to shorten the workday and ultimately, hopefully, seize control of the workplace. That was the version of Marx that was emphasized during the Gilded Age. And I think it's probably the best way to think about the parameters of the American left in that period, whether you're talking about the Knights of Labor or the Socialist Party or the Wobblies. Fast forward a few decades to the Great Depression, and many Americans again turned to Marx as a prophet for transcending capitalism. But the Marx they turned to in the 1930s was the one who innovated a convincing theory explaining how and why capitalism was always generating these massive global crises, which was related to the way in which production outstripped demand, or rather how capital accumulation outpaced wage growth. So the scale and scope of the Great Depression did not catch Marxists, communists, socialists, etc. in the 1930s entirely by surprise, because they had long been pointing to blockages in the flow of capital that engendered a cycle of boom and bust. They believed that these cycles were ever intensifying, which was evident in the fact that the 1930s depression far outstripped the 1893 downturn, which far surpassed the 1873 panic, and so on. So they firmly believed, based upon the reading of Marx, that a crisis tremendous enough to bring down the whole system almost seemed inevitable. So various socialists, communists, labor unionists, social democrats, just people of the left, generally speaking, turned to Marx in the 1930s because he theorized capitalism's doomsday, but also he offered a few ideas, some nuggets of what was to come next. So they treated him in this time period as a prophet, but they also knew that they themselves had to fit Marx's ideas to the American situation. And as such, many notable intellectuals, how I would describe it is they hid themselves away in libraries in an obsessive effort to redefine Marx for the American situation. They believed that if the genius of Marx could be unlocked, if it could be made to fit America, this was very important to them, making Marx almost an American theorist, that all the difficult questions about capitalism and revolution would be answered. So the 1930s is the biggest boom period in the American reception of Karl Marx. More Americans read him favorably then than at any other time across US history. Related, I would argue the 1930s left had the most profound effect on American life at any time period in US history. The New Deal, for instance, although no left-wing project, was in part shaped as a response to the left, as a way to bring the militant left into the fold of the state, of the liberal institutions, a way to sop up its most radical and militant energies. The New Deal made life better for a lot of the working class, despite not being a working class project, a left-wing project, precisely because of the left, the Marxist left. During the 1960s, young rebels again discovered Marx, this time as inspiration for the resistance to the imperialist war machine that was savaging Southeast Asia. These new leftists referenced primitive accumulation, of course a term from capital that became shorthand at the time for the plunders of colonialism, slavery, genocide, all in the service of capitalism. Young leftists in this context found a comrade in Marx who lamented the conquest and looting that were occurring constantly at the margins of the capitalist system. But what's interesting to me, at least in this context, is that Marx, the anti-imperialist, was ultimately not the Marx who won the hearts and minds of many 1960s new leftists. Rather, that Marx was the young Marx, or the eloquent bard of alienation found in his early writings, translations of which finally made their way into American hands after the Second World War. This young Marx, who wrote about how capitalism estranges from man his own body, as well as external nature and his spiritual aspect, his human aspect, this found a kindred spirit in a growing number of young activists who believed that the world was increasingly hostile to the human spirit. So each of these three eras in US history, the Gilded Age, the 1930s, and the 1960s, was unique. Yet in each, a booming market for Marx emerged because readers believed that he provided something missing in terms of American political discourse as a way to explain and improve their lives. In each of these historical moments, Marx helped American leftists define their mission. So now, I hesitantly argue that we're living through the fourth boom period in the Marx reception. Lots of people across the world, but including in the United States, are thinking about Marx to a degree not matched since the 60s, but I would argue perhaps even since the 1930s. This current Marx boom began with the financial crisis, the collapse of 2008. By the end of this year, the Communist Manifesto and Capital began flying off the proverbial shelves. The Communist Manifesto reached #1 on Amazon, which is weird because you can download it for free online. But Marx re-entered the mainstream discourse at that point and has yet to leave. Sometimes the discourse has been smart, not always though. One Marxist scholar in 2008 predicted that Marx could yet become the most influential thinker of the 21st century. So what kind of Marx reception are we now experiencing? To me, that's an important question because it might help us understand what type of left we could become. Whether it's a millennial left, a zoomer left, I don't know what kind of left we're moving towards. Some of the most influential Marxist analyses since 2008 have been explanations for the latest crisis in capitalism. For example, David Harvey's 2010 book, The Enigma of Capital and the Crises of Capitalism, which used Marxist theory about how capital is constantly in motion as a starting point for determining the roots of the 2008 implosion. Marx has also been at the center of a wave of ecological scholarship or ecological socialism, eco-socialism. I don't know if you follow some of these debates. I've been following them sort of like with interest lately because Marx has been a sort of topic of debate between degrowth socialists who have looked anew at some of Marx's late-in-life letters in order to argue that Marx actually during his lifetime had changed his mind about the progressive capacities of capitalism. So that's one end of the debate, and then the eco-modernists who kind of stick to their Marxist guns, that a Marxist left cannot give up on technological progress, but rather must appropriate it for the working class masses. To me, all of this speaks to the capaciousness of Marx, but also to the sort of heterogeneity of today's left that is pretty fragmented, scattered, sometimes confused. All that said, I'll conclude by arguing that freedom, this word freedom, is the watchword of the current Marx boom. Focusing on how a growing number of scholars, thinkers, and activists are reading Marx as a theorist of freedom, And if you'd like, in the Q&A, I can list the dozens of books that have come out about Marx as a theorist of freedom in the last 10 years. Helps us come to terms with the nascent project of the 21st socialist left. In the context of a global labor market that promises little more than a lifetime of drudgery, lots of people in the US and elsewhere want to be freed from having to sell their labor in order to survive. But the problem that begs solutions, and I think perhaps something we should talk about tonight, is does a left exist as an effective institutional home for the growing number of people who might currently exist in this Marxist plane of ideological existence? In our current Marx boom, I think we can detect the seeds of a large, potentially transformative left in the US and elsewhere. But where shall those seeds take root and sprout? I don't have an answer to that. I hope some of you do. So thank you.
Doing the dreaded thing of reading from my phone. All right, so my prepared remarks is titled "The Millennial Left is Unborn." Ironically, it might only be now that the 21st century is really beginning, but this comes after the death of the Millennial Left, which strived but failed to be true to what was new and different about the 21st century, instead falling back on rehearsing and repeating the 20th century, to which it remained beholden. But the demand of 20th century history was to overcome it. But the demand of the 20th century was to overcome it. Capitalism is already doing so. Meanwhile, what the Millennial Left abandoned as its task has been taken up by Trump. Trump, as the last 20th century political figure, is finally ushering in the 21st. Trump began his political ambitions in the 1980s Reaganite neoliberal boom, that era of optimism that gave birth to the millennial generation. Unfortunately, they entered adulthood just when the first war on terror and then the Great Recession, the war on terror and then the Great Recession hit, robbing them of their life chances. The first political response to these twin crises was Obama's election in 2008. But Obama's failure led to the Republican Party, Tea Party revolt, and Occupy Wall Street. When Obama was re-elected in 2012, both Bernie Sanders and Trump decided to run in 2016. Bernie to represent the dashed hopes of the millennials, Trump to finally, after several election cycles of hesitation and frustration, throw his hat into the ring. But where Trump was determined to win election in 2016, Bernie aspired only to shape the Democrats' program and message, winning back the young voters who elected Obama in 2008 but were disaffected by 2016. Both Trump and Bernie offered to fulfill the millennial promise betrayed by Obama. But this betrayal began long before, at the very beginning of the new millennium, and indeed earlier. Trump first floated his presidential ambition in 1987, towards the end of Reagan's second term, in response to the dawning end of the Soviet Union, the Iran-Contra debacle, Reagan's illegal immigration amnesty, and the Black Monday stock market crash. Trump believed the promise of American renewal, signaled by Reagan, was being squandered. He was attracted to the political campaign of Texan computer systems engineer and entrepreneur billionaire Ross Perot, whose run in 1992 cost Reagan's vice president, Bush Sr., re-election and allowed Bill Clinton to win with a minority of the votes. But in 2000, Trump left the Reform Party Perot had started when it was taken over by Reagan's speechwriter, Pat Buchanan, whom Trump called a fascist, decrying him as too right-wing, too nationalist, and too culturally conservative. So what was potentially squandered by the US after the Cold War? It was called at the time the peace dividend. What was this based on? First, as I've written about previously regarding Milton Friedman, it must be understood that neoliberalism was not anti, but post-Fordism. an attempt to realize the potential of Fordism. This is why Trump and his following can appear as harking back both to the 1950s and to the 1990s, bookending the long New Left era. The post-Cold War New World Order, announced by Bush Sr. at the time of the Gulf War in 1991, suggested not a peace dividend, but continuing of the supposed military Keynesianism of the permanent arms economy in the military-industrial complex, which Eisenhower warned of already back in 1960. So we're haunted not only by the problems of neoliberalism, but mid-20th century Fordism as well. The past that Trump recalled was uncomfortable, to say nothing of his newfound fondness for William McKinley and embrace of the 19th century Gilded Age era of tariff industrial protectionism. It recalls a pre-progressivism era of capitalism. Trump had been somewhat assuaged by Clinton's victory in 1992, but soon felt betrayed again, specifically by Clinton's embracing of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement that had been negotiated by the prior Bush administration, and that Clinton had denounced in his 1992 campaign, and had been Perot's central target, famously warning of the giant sucking sound in the American economy and society that it portended. Trump was a dissident to 1990s neoliberal globalization, also the target of the left at the time, as seen by 1999's Battle of Seattle, at which labor unions demonstrably dumped foreign goods, in a callback of sorts to the Boston Tea Party of the American Revolution and War of Independence. In 2000, at the end of the Clinton presidency, and after Newt Gingrich's Republican Revolution in Congress, giving rise not to the vast right-wing conspiracy Hillary saw in the Monica Lewinsky affair, but rather a bipartisan bill, Trump was with Jesse Ventura in the Reform Party, bolting from Buchanan's American nationalist conservatism that abandoned Ross Perot's original Reform Party's common sense centrism. Soon afterwards, Trump supported Hillary Clinton's run for Senate and invited the Clintons to his wedding to Melania. George W. Bush won the 2000 election promising to abandon what he called the arrogance of Clintonian globalism, attacking Clinton and his VP Al Gore's nation-building foreign policy. Of course, 9/11 reversed this, ironically, and turned Bush's presidency into the neoliberal global crusade of the Project for a New American Century that had been hatched previously by Clinton's Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. Trump was an early critic of the War on Terror and rode discontents with the forever wars into the White House, becoming the peace president that Obama only promised but failed to be. The clearest indicator of counties voting for Trump was military family density, bearing the brunt of the traumatic wars that became the longest in US history. And military families are predominantly, overwhelmingly working class, as the poverty draft had manned the US military after the Vietnam era. In 2016, Trump said he wanted the Republican Party to represent the working class and warned against it being the conservative party. He said American politics, unlike other countries, didn't need a conservative party. He has often said that because he ran as a Republican, he had to tailor his message to win Republican voters, but that it would have been different if he had run as a Democrat. He sought in his first term to craft a new bipartisan consensus and even welcomed the new Democrat congressional majority in the midterm election as an opportunity to ally with Democrats and break Republican resistance to his policies, for instance, on infrastructure spending. I narrate Trump's political career in order, as myself as a Gen X leftist, to show how it parallels discontents of the left throughout these preceding decades. Opposition to NAFTA and neoliberal globalization more generally, disaffection with the two presidencies of the post-Reagan neoliberal era, Clinton and Obama, and rejection of the cultural conservatism of the Reagan Revolution. While Trump was never a progressive, he was always a middle-of-the-road moderate, as has and will always be the preponderant majority of the working class. Trump was and remains a Reagan Democrat, meaning someone who could represent the working class swing voters that decide elections in capitalist politics, but who never agree with the self-conceptions of policymakers or campaign marketers, to whom both appealing to the working class appears as chimerical folly, and Trump ultimately makes no sense. But a real socialist left would have to make better sense of Trump's appeal, while also sharing the frustration with capitalist politics and policy that he represents politically. Socialists would have to represent such discontents better than Trump does. Ever since Reagan, or perhaps Nixon, the Republicans have represented dissent against the dominant Democratic Party progressive liberal political order, which the left is oriented around. I I have spent the last 20 years accompanying the millennial and now the Zoomer left as a teacher. I spent the prior 20 years, 40 in total now, as a leftist, going back to my high school activism and reading from Marxism. The millennial left is now as old biologically as I am as a self-conscious leftist and Marxist. I can say that the problems have remained the same throughout that time. And nothing new means precisely that something different must be done now on the left. Rosa Luxemburg wrote about 40 years, an entire biblical generation, in the desert. I can attest to that being my time. Is something possible now in the new century and millennium that wasn't previously? If the older generations had to go under so that a new one can enter the promised land, or at least embark on the road to it. That time is now. Perhaps the millennials were not the first of the 21st, but the last of the 20th. There was a time, a long time ago, namely more than a century now, when the socialist left could and did make sense of working class discontents and aspirations to overcome the manifest problems of capitalism, and were able to build out of this a mass base for socialist politics, independently of capitalist politics. This was before socialism liquidated itself into capitalist progressivism, starting in the 1920s and 30s and growing ever more desperate and implausible through the 60s and 70s new left up to the recent failure of the millennial left. The Democrats have long been called the graveyard of the left, more specifically the graveyard of movements. But that means it's where they go after they die, not what killed them. They committed suicide as leftist movements, and this is how they ended up in the Democratic Party, actually giving it new life. How did they kill themselves politically? By abandoning their ambition. Why did they do so? Because they could see no way forward. This is where we are now, a sense of profound impasse. But Trump is moving forward. Does the left hope only for Trump to be mired in their own inability to change, their resistance? At the outset of the millennial left, by contrast, it was capitalist politics that seemed resistant to change, and the left that wanted to move things forward. This is where progressivism manifested its problem. Was socialism progressive? Or did it seek to return to a lost past? Did the millennials seek to undo neoliberalism or to move beyond it? The socialist impulse gave way to progressivism because socialism was embraced according to its neoliberal definition: welfare statism, contra private property, and civil social freedom. The freedom of the capitalists was disgusting, and the freedom of the working class was scary. The Democrats were not always the progressive capitalist party, but only became so with FDR, and in many respects, fully only after LBJ. The socialist Eugene Debs ended his political life in the late 1920s supporting the progressive Republican La Follette. This augured the later Communist Party support for FDR and his New Deal of the Popular Front against war and fascism that prevented neither. Closing the 20th century now means breaking with that tradition of Democratic Party progressivism that defined it. It was always and remains permanently the terminus of socialism. The opportunity for moving on today for a potentially socialist movement in politics is the crisis of neoliberalism and the changes in capitalism resulting from it. But not at the level of policy, but society. Back in the 1980s and 90s, the Reagan Revolution was used as an excuse to abandon socialism by my mentors, Adolph Reed and Moishe Postone, for instance. And the Trump Revolution is being used similarly now. The problem is that would-be socialists never rose to the occasion of the crisis of capitalism met back in the 70s and 80s by neoliberalism. And the millennials failed to do so in the crisis of neoliberalisms of the 20s and 10s, defining themselves against Trumpian post-neoliberalism and seeing only a chimerical mirage of somehow undoing neoliberalism and returning to pre-neoliberal capitalism, namely the 20th century. Ironically, both Trump and the millennial left yearned for a return to the 1990s boom era that was the height of neoliberalism, before the War on Terror and Great Recession. But both dressed up this nostalgia as a desire for a more mythic past that never was, perhaps the post-World War II Golden Age, or an even deeper past of humanity and true grit, whether of the 1930s Great Depression, New Deal, and its heroic anti-fascism, or of Gilded Age, Second Industrial Revolution, and Second International Socialism against the robber barons. The time of McKinley and William Jennings Bryan populism that led to the progressive era. But bookending the other side of the 20th century Bryant's populism, as well as Roosevelt's progressivism, failed, leading instead to Woodrow Wilson and World War I, the 20th century of war, revolution, and catastrophe, in fascism and communism, an end to capitalism, and its apocalyptic continuation after the end of the world. The millennials tried but failed to snap out of the nightmare waiting from the past century, but were shocked by the rude awakening provided by Trump. Their awakening, in response, was just a depressed return to restless sleep, an insistence on staying bedridden in the 20th century, long after its convalescence was over, in an endemic PTSD response. The millennials refused to read the poetry of the Trumpian future, insisting instead that capitalism could not survive, and if not capitalism, then the human race, or the earth itself, consumed in the AI singularity of capitalism's black hole in fossil fuel carbon reduction of all organic matter to ash in global warming or cooling or nuclear winter. As Max Weber said, capitalism will end only with the last ton of fossil fuel burning up. He didn't reckon nuclear fission and its infinite hellfire and brimstone. No, it will continue. Cold fusion will give capitalism endless life, in deep space if need be, without even the sun. Energy needs will be reduced to the mere molecular movement of digits. Not an event horizon of gravitational collapse, but an ongoing purgatory, the haunted afterlife and suspended animation that has followed the failure of socialism in the 20th century. But as Mao said to Nixon, what the left proposed, the right pushes through. History moves on, even its end is not the end. The left, for its part, refusing to accept its death, will remain stuck in the 20th century long after capitalism has already moved on in the 21st, ushered in by Trump. Its restless ghosts of the dead will tap on the windows, but stay trapped behind glass, looking on from the oblivion to which it has been permanently consigned outside of history, a mere idea. A socialist left that could meet the tasks of the 21st century has yet to come into existence. Can we anticipate it now? I used to think, when I first started teaching academically and soon after on the left in and through Platypus, that we had moved out from under the postmodernism that dominated the late 20th century. Now it seems we are stuck right back in it. At least the so-called left remains stuck there, still in the thrall of French theory and under the shadow of Stalinism. But it didn't always appear so. It seemed in the earlier 21st century that something struggled to be born in the millennial left. Now that moment has passed. What remains is the ghost of its unfulfilled potential. It was not undead because it never lived. The millennial left seems to have been the last gasp of the 20th century, strangled in the grip of its dead hand. In 2017, I announced that the millennial left is dead. Now I will say the millennial left was unborn.
Okay, now we will give about 3 minutes for each of the panelists to respond to the other speakers, and we'll just go in the order that we spoke. So, Alex first.
I think it sounds like, in a lot of ways, we're looking at things from a similar perspective. I think, Brett, you pointed to some things which Prometheus we've been thinking about. Especially I was thinking about the idea of winning from opposition, winning reforms, winning the demands from opposition, which I think is a productive way to think about politics, and in many ways that has happened. There have been some victories for tenants movement in the UK as well that have come again from right-wing reactionary governments. And I think that relates to a question of having a patient, long-term strategy and a vision for maybe the sort of 10 to 15, 20 years of what you want to achieve. I'd like to ask you to expand on Merino reversing class alignment, just because I thought that's an interesting thing which I wasn't familiar with.
I mean, I can't give you like exact numbers and statistics, but basically when AMLO won in 2018, Moreno got most of the support, or at least very high support from highly educated voters, and that share declined by the time that regional elections happened a few years later, and the number of non-college educated, working class, peasant voters that went to the party increased. So that's the exact opposite kind of trend that you've seen in something in the US, where once upon a time, wasn't that long ago, that if you were of a certain income, if you were like a business owner, you would vote Democratic, and if you were wealthier, you were Republican. Now it's kind of a little bit all over the place, and it's kind of bifurcated based on things like education and other lines.
I'll be brief so I can cede my minutes to the Q&A. But I guess, so I'm all about introspection, even self-criticism, leftist self-criticism, I guess, is sometimes necessary. But I also think I would give the current left or the millennial left a break in this sense. So when you first see a viable left emerge in the US context, and so I'm a US historian, I'll be speaking about the US, but this could be, a lot of these lessons are applicable in other contexts. When you first see a viable left emerge in the US in the late 19th century, and by left here I mean like kind of, I do mean a Marxist left that is sort of thinking about how to organize against capitalism. Many of the people who had who had come into left-wing circles, whether it was through socialist parties or wobblies or various increasingly militant labor union movements, they remembered a world other than capitalism. They remembered a world, they had experienced a world, their parents had experienced a world that was not about wage labor, that was not about the time clock, that was not about the factory. And so they could easily imagine another world because they had experienced another world. Maybe their world as Sicilian peasants or like small farm owners in Illinois was not an ideal world, but it was better, they thought, than the factory. And so when you have a lot of people who have a sort of imagination of a better, a different world, it's easier to inspire people to organize for that better world. Now there's no such, people can't imagine another world because we've never lived in another world other than capitalist hellscape, however you want to describe it. That makes it very difficult to organize a left. If you look at the 1930s, there was maybe the sort of pre-capitalist world had faded for many people, but they could imagine another world because they had models like the Bolshevik Revolution, and they had a party in the US setting, a communist party, or the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which was closely aligned at times with the Communist Party. They had places to go to organize and feel like they could really improve their lives as leftists against capitalism. Nothing like that, to my mind, to such an extent has existed for a very long time, at least the last 40 or 50 years, maybe longer. And so I guess introspection's good, but I have a hard time sort of blaming the left for the lack of a left.
Yeah, let me quickly respond. I think we'll probably disagree on this question of like, is there a left? I mean, I think I have a less pessimistic view. I don't think like that the millennial left, or whatever you want to say, is stillborn or never really existed. I think we're in the process of seeing what it's going to amount to. I think it itself is in the process of figuring out how to navigate this. I mean, I think, yeah, you're right. There is an upsurge now of people reading Marx. There's an upsurge in general of left-wing organizing. I think, the last 10 years is a very short time frame through which to evaluate, was this a failure or a success? I think we're still in the middle of it. I mean, in the past, few months, there's been a lot of, people, hundreds of people turning up to DSA meetings around the country. There's suddenly, people are talking about oligarchy in their public rhetoric. There's clearly a kind of, similar to when Trump won the first time, there is now an upsurge in kind of people taking interest in left-wing ideas. Now the question is, can whatever comes of this moment, can it overcome some of the things that held the left back, in that first Trump term? I think anecdotally, based on just people that I interact with, based on just observing things, I think there is a movement away from some of the stuff that may have hamstrung left-wing organizing earlier in this period, a movement away from some of that kind of, for lack of a better term, identitarianism, cancel culture stuff, more of a realization that there needs to be more focus on kind of class first politics, while not throwing away, the basic defense of people's rights and dignity out the window completely, but having that be the kind of main principle. And you can look at something like the Dan Osborne campaign in Nebraska, where this was a guy who, in a campaign that was supported by much of the left, it was seen as a sort of great hope for the kind of argument that people, at least electorally, that people on the left have made. A decade ago, he might have been, savaged and cancelled by a swarm of people because he took a whole bunch of positions on kind of social and cultural issues that would be seen as a betrayal. But I think there was more of an understanding of, to win over some communities, to win over some parts of the country, you are going to have a little bit of flexibility, have a little bit of give, if you want to proceed with that fundamental kind of question of overhauling the economic system. So, yeah, I think we're in the process of watching the left learn from its mistakes. What that leads to, I don't know. And whether this, huge opposition to Trumpism right now, whether that actually creates an atmosphere that's conducive to the kind of, change that the left wants to see, I also don't know, because perhaps people will say, we just want to kind of settle down and not have any disruption for a while. I don't know, but I think we're still in the middle of that process.
Okay, so a couple of things. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, I don't think that we're at the end of a 10-year cycle. I think we're at the end of a 20-year cycle, because I've been there throughout the entire trajectory of the millennials' politicization when they were in college in the early 2000s with the war on terror. And I also, mentioned my 40 years history in the left, and I think that we've come full circle with respect to that as well. For instance, Alex, you mentioned Israel-Palestine. To me, the Israel-Palestine issue, while important in and of itself, is also symbolically a marker of the complete flatlining of the left. Meaning that is the thing that we have to point to, the radicalization in the last couple of years. Notwithstanding the fact that the Israeli war in Gaza is the greatest catastrophe that has befallen the Palestinian people since the establishment of the State of Israel, nonetheless, that as an issue of the left is a perennial issue, at least for my generation, and shows that a certain kind of horizon of politics has been abandoned. Now, also, this notion of resistance. So when Platypus started, we started with two panels like this. Our first panel was on imperialism on the left, anti-imperialism on the left. The second panel was on revolution, reform, and resistance, and why resistance politics has dominated the left since the 60s. And again, the diagnosis was, well, resistance politics is about abandoning not only revolution, but even abandoning reform. Now, I pointed as well to the fact that the last 10 years, if we're going to take that interval as our starting point, we're going to name the millennial left just the Bernie left, then we're really looking at reform, and then we're looking at progressivism, and the question of progressive reform of capitalism and what that means. Meaning, okay, in the New Deal era, the Great Depression gave birth to a new form of capitalism, Fordism, in the mid-20th century, Keynesian David Hartman. In a very similar way, the Gilded Age didn't give rise to socialist revolution. It did give rise to progressivism, to progressive reform, which ultimately had to wait till the Great Depression to be fully realized. Do we see Woodrow Wilson? Do we see FDR as leftists? They obviously are not, right? So they're obviously capitalist politicians who didn't, reform capitalism in a socialist direction, but rather did what was necessary in terms of what capitalism itself demanded regarding change. That's why I tied the Millennial Left to Trump. Meaning, if Trump is the anti-Obama, well then, what do we make of that? In other words, what about the failure of the Obama presidency? What about, what led to both Bernie and Trump discontents with Obama? If Bernie came out of Occupy Wall Street, what did Occupy Wall Street signify? Why did Occupy Wall Street happen a year after the Tea Party revolt by the Republicans? So what we've been seeing in the last 20 years is the emergence of a new form of capitalism, and the left has been generated by that, but has also capitulated to it. So that, of course, now in a second Trump term, there's going to be anti-Trump resistance. I have a hard time imagining how that's going to be anything but feeding into the Democratic Party in the midterm elections and in the next presidential cycle. So finally, to bring it back to it, why I insist on the 20-year cycle of the Millennial Left, because I remember 2006, 2007, when Platypus started. Also at the University of Chicago in 2006, the New Students for Democratic Society were founded. Now, even though they took their namesake from the old STS of the New Left, they actually aimed to be something different from the old STS. They were advised on this by what called themselves the MDS, the Movement for Democratic Society, veterans of the old STS, who at the founding convention of the new STS here at the University of Chicago said, don't repeat us. Don't do what we did. Don't be just primarily organized against the war, because what did us in was the Vietnam War being our central focus. Don't allow yourself to be terrorized by racism into becoming obsessed with racial politics, because that's what led to the neoliberal identity politics, Democratic Party situation. There was, even though they called themselves the Students for a Democratic Society, after the old 60s formation, they wanted socialism. They did want socialism. And that was before the 2008 crisis. That was before the 2008 crisis. So they wanted to be not just an anti-war movement, they wanted socialism. Where did that go? Right? So when I say the Millennial Left died in 2017, and when I say in some ways it was never born, the question is, what would a 21st century struggle for socialism look like? How would it need to look different than the 20th century struggle for socialism, especially given the fact that the 20th century struggle for socialism did not lead to socialism in any way. Only that 19th century struggle for socialism led to the Russian Revolution. I'd be remiss not to mention the last couple of years, the Zoomer left. There's a return to Stalinism. There's a strong attraction to Stalinism now. And precisely out of anti-imperialism and around issues like Israel-Palestine. This has been an overwhelming ideological phenomenon in terms of whatever Zoomer left exists. They are frankly, proudly Stalinist. They say things like, you can't stop with Lenin, because if you stop with Lenin, you'll end up a Trotskyist or a Frankfurt School pessimist. You've got to go with Stalin. You've got to go with Mao. You've got to go with Deng Xiaoping. You've got to go with Xi Jinping, because that's positive socialism, that's socialist construction. To me, this is just the final gasp of the 20th century hanging over us. And that's why I said the 21st century has yet to be born.
Okay, we'll go to the Q&A now.
on everyone's mind, or at least it's been in my Instagram feed, has been the tariffs. You know, this is kind of one of Trump's big economic policies come to fruition. And you know, obviously here, where this isn't like an economics forum, we're not talking about, oh, well, you know, how will this affect the stock market? But like, you know, is this like, you know, can this be taken as a sign of sort of the new economic regime, and how should we be responding to it? Should we be like, you know, like you kind of talk about this sort of nostalgia for the New Deal, and you know, people are often talking about, oh, well, you know, the tariffs in the 1930s weren't working. Should we be trying to refer to the past, or should there be something, like, should we come up with some sort of new response to this sort of, this inaugural, you know, stroke of Trump's planned economic regime? Thank you.
I mean, I'll say I don't think a knee-jerk opposition to tariffs as a whole is the right way to respond. Tariffs can be a very useful tool. You know, I think the problem with the way that the Trump administration is doing it is that it is very likely to cause either disaster or, you know, kneecap what the actual goal of these things is meant to be, which is the idea is to reshore American manufacturing, build up American manufacturing in this country. You know, can you do that with tariffs alone if you're not pairing it with, you know, tax breaks and subsidies and government investment to make sure that you know, you can actually build those factories and you know, start that up? I'm not sure you can. You know, and especially the way that it's done. You know, it's done. These particular tariffs have been done in a way where the formula used to calculate them doesn't make a lot of sense, and creates a tremendous amount of business uncertainty, which makes it very difficult to, you know, if somebody who does want to suddenly build up, you know, manufacturing in this country, they, you know, will be less inclined to, because they're looking at a really uncertain environment where policy can change on a whim suddenly. Anyway, I could go on about the criticism of the tariffs, but I think tariffs have a place in, you know, left-wing economic policy. I think if the left needs to articulate a response to this, it should be to A, criticize the most kind of destructive and damaging element of those tariffs, but then to also articulate a kind of an alternative vision of how those can be used. And I think, you know, basically saying that targeted tariffs on certain industries, you know, cars for instance, coupled with a program of government investment, you know, something like what Biden tried to do in his term, would be the way to do that, but not like, you know, just a blanket spraying of tariffs that ends up pissing off most of the world and, you know, making us poorer.
Just briefly, I think that Trump's tariffs represent sort of like his anti-neoliberal impulses, but they're combined with his sort of strict oligarchy regime, in the sense that like a targeted tariff is only going to help maybe rebuild a manufacturing base to the benefit of the working class if there's an expansion of like labor rights, and they're cracking down on labor rights by stripping the NLRB at the very same time that they're implementing these probably highly disruptive tariffs. So it's just another version of oligarchy.
I'll just say something briefly because I was actually solicited by Compact to write an article on tariffs. We're working on it this weekend. It'll come out early next week. You know, it looks like part of a broader attempt by Trump to restructure both American and global capitalism, as has happened a few times before. Meaning the Bretton Woods Agreement after World War II, Nixon's breaking of the Bretton Woods Agreement in the early 1970s, and Reagan's Plaza Accords, which involved, the latter two involved renegotiation of the value of the dollar relative to other currencies, in which the other countries, the main creditors of the United States, accepted to feel the burden, bear the burden of the loss involved in the devaluation of the dollar. So it's you know, and is it going to be regressive at a socioeconomic level? For sure, right? So it's definitely putting the needs of capital above those of labor. But as Marxists, we should understand that capital and labor are not simply opposed, but are dialectically interrelated. I would simply say that, again, a new form of capitalism is coming. A new form of capitalism is coming. So the question is actually something, Andrew, that you raised about the Gilded Age, like the memory of pre-proletarian labor, of not capitalism. You know, the Industrial Revolution came to the United States late. It came after the Civil War. So it's part of the Second Industrial Revolution, the industrialization of the United States. There was, of course, some industrial labor prior to that, but it really came full force in the Gilded Age. I think that it's something that haunts us when we think about socialism, especially in a place like the United States, that the height of the socialist movement in the United States actually was, I would argue, in that Gilded Age era, and seems to be about that initial wave of proletarianization. That raises some uncomfortable questions for us, which is to say, is a working class response to capitalism inherently conservative reactionary in nature? Is it always holding on to a form of production that capitalism is destroying, is washing away in a new industrial revolution? It's tricky, right? So again, I think that on the one hand, that's an uncomfortable issue. On the other hand, it also allows us to challenge a progressivist narrative, where the only reforms that are conceivable are those that are catching up with and appropriate to, adapting to, the needs of the new form of capitalism, and not pointing to socialism, not pointing to overcoming capitalism. So what I imagine is that, yes, we've now been living for generations under industrial capitalism in a place like the United States. However, each new wave of capitalism appears quite different from what came before it. And so therefore, there will be this nostalgia for the past, but can that be leveraged in a different direction? Right? It doesn't have to just be a conservative reaction. It doesn't have to be a kind of Luddism. It doesn't. But again, that would presume a socialist movement, as opposed to a movement that's very unclear about what it really wants, especially if ultimately it only really wants a kind of progressive reform of capitalism.
I'll just quickly say on that, I mean, I think the thing that perhaps concerns me is whether this sort of new process, which is going to happen and the left is going to have no influence on it, whether it's going to lead to greater deindustrialization in Europe and Mexico and other places, and also what, you know, related to the ecological critique of capitalism that's being recovered, you know, what do we think industrialization should look like? Do we think that there should be some level of reindustrialization, and how can we do that in a way which doesn't either repeat the sort of oppressive dynamics of the workplace, but also the sort of ecological impacts. Yeah.
Yeah, and then we'll go in the back.
Okay. I want to pick up on something Andrew said to sort of pose a question to the whole panel. Andrew, you pointed out how the left keeps reaching back to Marx to justify what it does. So you mentioned the eco-socialism explosion recently, and how they're digging up letters from Marx to justify, you know, this or that position. And Alex, you raised sort of the Corbyn experience, and of course the left was there with, you know, Marx in hand to justify that. And Bronco, you mentioned, you know, sort of the number of policy victories over the last few years, and I'm sure there are many people on the left who argued for these policies. Certainly there are Marxists who argue for and support UMLO or Scheinbaum and Morena. So my question is, you know, what is this thing, the left in the 21st century? And why does it feel like it needs to reach back to the 19th century to Marx to justify what it does? Does it need any of this? to justify what it does? Does it need Marx to justify the COVID support checks, or the eviction ban, or the anti-globalization protests, or anti-imperialism? Did any of it need the left, and did the left need Marx to justify any of it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Obviously, I've been thinking a lot about it for a long time. Well, I don't, whether you like it or not, and I'm not sure I like it, but in order for humans to organize, they have to have a common set of like values, principles, ideas, and it just so happens that since the late 19th century, Marx has proven for the left maybe the text of people organizing against capitalism. I would argue precisely because the central element of Marx that seems to just like, I'm not going to disagree that we have had several forms of capitalism, but the kernel of capitalism that Marx addressed in The Working Day and Capital about how capital extracts value from the exploitation of labor, I just think that's been true forever, and that if you want to, forever since capitalism, and if you want to organize a socialist resistance or communist resistance to capitalism, that has to be central to what you're doing. Marx articulated that most famously, I would argue most eloquently, but that's beside the point, most famously, and that's the one reason people continue to return to it. So would it be better, as Marx said, to look to the poetry of the future rather than the nostalgia of the past? It probably would, but humans do this thing. And so I'm really interested in why we do it, and I think that's why we do it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say that I think way to look at it, rather than like, does Marx needed to justify these things? More, think of it more as what was the role of Marx and Marx's writings in terms of kind of being the thing that set people down that road. You know, I mean, you're not necessarily going to find a specific piece of legislation going back to Marx's text, but it's his writings that have informed the thinking of people who have ended up either trying to come up with different ways to structure the economy, or that have inspired people to actually organize to make these things a reality. So I think that's the role of Marx. It's in terms of shaping the thinking of the people who are actually doing this stuff. Does that make sense?
Bronco and Alex, maybe one way to bring you guys in. I feel like on this side of the table, we have a discussion about, maybe there hasn't been a kind of new interpretation of Marx or a new idea of what the left would be. I mean, do you think that there's kind of a new way that these ideas have been used? What would it mean to kind of, have a new vision for what the left looks like? I think that's kind of related to the question that's being asked and kind of get a discussion.
Well, I think, as Andrew said, that there have been these really important new uses of Marx, and particularly Marx as a thinker of freedom and Republican freedom that stands out to me as the strand that's very important to pick up on, and it's very obvious why that is. The legacy that we're sort of dealing with also related to your question. I think the left naturally does turn to Marx, but Marx can be used to justify just about anything. I was reminded of one of our renegade Marxists, or I don't know what to call him, Paul Mason in the UK, sort of famously said, if you don't see what Keir Starmer's doing is advancing the class struggle, then you don't understand social democracy from a Marxist point of view. And I don't know what the working is behind that, but obviously we can use Marx in whatever way we see fit, and that is in some ways a downside, and we can look at things like that and see it as frustrating, but also it means that we can put Marxism to use in the way that's most useful to our moment, and we can think for ourselves. And I think that's what people in this room are united around, and what the sects of the far left have an issue with in their sort of political education as sort of this doctrinaire reading of Marx.
Okay, we're gonna go back there, yeah, yes, exactly right. And then we'll go to
Hi. Real quick before I ask my question, I have a couple of quotes that are very short that I wanted to read. So Adorno once said, "The new does not add itself to the old, but remains the old in distress." And elsewhere he said, and forgive me, I don't have the exact quote, "Everything that can be said has been said before, usually better the first time." So Chris, I think you touched a little on my question, but I wanted to ask, how has the left in the 21st century distinguished itself from the failures of the left before it to bring about socialism? How has it failed to do so?
Does anybody want to take this? Bronco, I do have a feeling that a lot of this discussion of the millennial left, and whether there's been a millennial left, and whether the left has any new ideas, might be something you haven't thought on.
Yeah, I mean, how's it different? How's it like the same failures? I mean, I think I kind of talked about that. I think some of the struggles with actually connecting lifting organizers to working class communities. I think that has been a problem in the past. I think in some ways, I mean, if we go back to the New Deal, actually that was a time when radicals were much more capably able to kind of link up with the labor movement, which is something that I think the contemporary left struggles with. So I think if I was to point to something that was done better in the 20th century that we are unable to replicate now, and we struggle to replicate, I think that would be it. That would be a big one.
Quickly, there are lots of hands up. So it's a good question. It's really difficult to answer, but I mean, one of the reasons I'm an atheist is because I'm not drawn to dogma, and of course, there's always been a sort of dogmatic interpretation of Marx going back to really Marx himself and the people around him. So I'm definitely like, if we're going to continue to think about Marx in terms of and Marxism in terms of how to think about the contemporary moment, we have to do so in new ways, even against Adorno's grim predictions or grim assertions. And Adorno was nothing if not grim. But I'll say this, so there's been this explosion of literature on thinking about Marx and the question of freedom. I briefly referenced it in my opening remarks. I could list a whole bunch of books. William Clare Roberts' Marx's Inferno. Vanessa Wills has a new book, Marx's Ethical Vision. Martin Hagelin, This Light. I mean, there's a whole list of them. And if it's your type of thing, I highly recommend it. But I think what is revealing to me about reading those books in the context of thinking about people's hatred of capitalism, which I think like there's never been as much hatred for capitalism in the history of capitalism as there is right now, but that people are unable to know what to do with that. And I guess that's why I think we are in a moment of possibility, but we're also in a moment where it's never been so difficult to organize against capitalism, I would argue, precisely because of the type of neoliberal capitalism that is so anti-solidaristic. And again, I'm not answering your question, but I think it's a good question that we should continue to think about. I just, like, how do you sort of square these things? Like, I think Bronco's exactly right. Like, sort of leftish positions have never been so popular, and yet Donald Trump's president. And it seems like we on the left don't have really a place to go in order to organize effectively against Donald Trump's presidency or against neoliberalism.
Let me just say something that I think we always need to remind ourselves of, which is that people think that the present form of capitalism with which we're discontented is capitalism. So there's been a lot of confusion regarding anti-neoliberalism. Again, in my opening remarks, I pointed out that this anti-globalization, anti-neoliberal left has been there from the beginning, from the 1990s. In my adult lifetime. And if we trace that back to anti-Reaganism, then it's my entire kind of political and conscious lifetime. So, we have people like Tucker Carlson saying, I was a Reaganite, I was a neoliberal, but now I know I was wrong, right? And we have to be against capitalism because capitalism destroys the family, XYZ. We have Steve Bannon saying, Marx was right, capitalism commodifies everything and dehumanizes us, and Lenin was right, power is in the streets. What the fuck? Right, okay, so I kind of have a feeling that the right understands Marx and Lenin better than the left does, actually. Kind of cut to the chase with it, or at least in a certain way, right? In a certain way, right-wing anti-capitalism. So anti-neoliberalism is just not going to cut it, especially because neoliberalism is over. And in some ways, the millennial left is all about neoliberalism being over, meaning the millennial left was generated by the crisis of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism has been, in its death throes. And again, progressives, the Democrats, they just want to keep it going. Right? They just want to keep it going. And something that I've been warning about for a number of years now, but I think that we'll still have yet to see it come to fruition, that the left will go from being anti-neoliberal to being nostalgic for neoliberalism under the new Trumpian post-neoliberalism. In the same way that the new left was originally generated in opposition to Fordism, but then as it aged out, became nostalgic for Fordism, and taught the new generation that they should want to go back to Fordism, right? And that's what I see with the millennials, that they see the mid-20th century, the kind of Keynesian Fordist form of capitalism as somehow socialistic. Somehow it was, the capitalists had to respond to the Soviet Union. They were forced to give us the welfare. No. All of that was just the needs of capitalism. That was the needs of capitalism. May be conditioned by certain things, but ultimately it was the form of capitalism. And so again, we tend to think, neoliberalism is like really capitalism. That stuff before neoliberalism wasn't really capitalism, it was kind of quasi-socialism. And with that mindset, we're going to be helpless for what's coming, right? Because the right has taken up anti-capitalism, at least in the form of anti-neoliberalism. They really have. Trump is going to cost the capitalist class billions in profits. The tariffs are going to wreck the neoliberal world order, and the capitalists are going to put up fierce resistance to it because it means losing a lot of their profits in the short run. We're already seeing it, right? So the Democrats are going to be the champions of the capitalists in this fight. How can socialists distinguish themselves from that? Because ultimately, all the anti-Trump stuff is going to be the capitalists coveting their profits, not willing to sacrifice them to the new form of capitalism that he's trying to bring about. In the short term, they're going to sacrifice. In the long term, of course, the capitalists always win. But in the short term, sometimes, like FDR did this, sometimes the politicians demand the sacrifice of one part of the capitalist class in order to keep capitalism going. They do that. This has happened before.
I I apologize if this is blunt, but I really wanted to ask the question of do we need a left and why? Because I feel like coming up in some of the discussion was certain things about what is a left were sort of left unstated, and rather forms of the left from the 20th century were appealed to. So I think, Bronco, you mentioned people talking about the oligarchy, for example. And I know, Alex, you mentioned the protesting against like Elbit systems. This is the Israel thing. So Israel, Palestine. And also I really enjoyed the history about how many times people have read Marx and what kind of different setting. And yet I've thought of all those things I just mentioned. The avowed right have done the same as well. Meaning the avowed rights talk about the oligarchy all the time. And of course, Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, they're against Israel, Palestine. They're like, end the war, this is a genocide. And even reading Marx, James Burnham, Sam Francis, like right-wing people who go, this is how the left oppresses us, and Karl Marx explained why. So for me, all of these forms are like associated with the left, and I think they're kind of held to explain why this is why the left is not dead, because they're active in some form, however fragmented. But I really want to ask the question of why do we need a left? Do we? Like, what is the real reason for that? What is the real need? How could it justify it?
Yeah, I mean, a good example of why you need the left is because all of those figures that you mentioned are very good at using left-wing rhetoric, but actually not really following through any of this. I mean, Tucker Carlson, for instance, says he's given up neoliberalism. Tucker Carlson's idea, for example, for raising the minimum wage was, well, we'll only allow corporations over a certain size to raise the minimum wage. Small business owners, which make up like, I know what percentage it is, but millions, tens of millions of workers, they can continue to pay their workers starvation wages. Yes, the right talks about oligarchy, but at the moment, what is that actually translating into? It translates into a sort of targeted, persecution of certain oligarchs, certain, people that are disfavored by the Republican Party or Trump. But overall, I mean, the entire centerpiece of the Trump agenda is to give a massive tax cut to the wealthy. Certainly the tariff stuff will lose a lot of people money, but there's also going to be a massive tax cut that is going to give them a lot of stuff. The tariffs also are meant to be paying for that tax cut, so the tariffs are kind of by their own admission, a way to divert, shift the tax burden further onto consumers, so they can cut taxes for wealthy people, and also a massive program of deregulation for almost every industry, while also privatizing things like Social Security, which is slowly kind of stealthily being done. So I think the reason why you need the left is because you need a countervailing force that's actually not just using this kind of rhetoric as a way to push through the same neoliberal agenda on steroids, but to actually make sure that what is being done is in keeping with the principles of a pro-working class agenda.
Yeah, so like, and I don't mean this to be glib, it might sound glib, but you only need a left if you care about working class people, period. If you care about their conditions, right? So throughout history, going back to the first industrial revolution, but especially since the second industrial revolution, the degree to which working class people had any sort of power over their lives, any sort of autonomy over their lives, was oftentimes in direct correlation to whether or not there was a left or labor movement that was organized around enhancing working class power. To me, that's how I define the left, and that's the kind of left we need. Right-wingers, liberals, everyone has always read and tried to understand Marx for various purposes. I mean, I have several chapters about right-wingers and liberals reading Marx and what it means to them, but they weren't interested in enhancing the power or conditions of the working class.
Because I would say, we only need a left insofar as it's a socialist left. Because, again, I'll point to the ambiguity of progressivism, meaning progressivism is a form of conservatism with regard to capitalism. I don't think that we can see progressivism from Woodrow Wilson or Theodore Roosevelt or even even from FDR and LBJ, and certainly not the progressivism that we've had in the neoliberal era of Clinton and Obama as moving us in any kind of socialist direction. Whether or not, I mean, I think we can suspend the question of whether or not it was just a way of deflecting socialism. I think that it much more had to do with needs of capitalism itself than with deflecting socialism. I think that we might flatter ourselves a little bit to say, oh, well, they needed to do this to stop socialist revolution. I think that can be somewhat far-fetched, especially in the 20th century. So really, when we say the left, we mean socialism. We do mean socialism. Now, colloquially, what has happened is the left means progressivism. It means progressive capitalism. It means the Democrats. But really, the left that we need is only a socialist left, because otherwise we're just dealing with progressive capitalism, and progressive capitalism itself is an ambiguous idea, meaning who's the progressive here? Maybe Trump's the progressive, maybe the Democrats are the conservatives, right? We're going to get lost in that tangle. Again, are we going to be with the Democrats trying to preserve the old form of capitalism against the new?
Yeah, I would just say on that, we need a left, a socialist left worthy of its name, because at the moment the left is tailing progressive movements, and I agree on that point. But also because those topics and those issues that we're talking about that we associate with progressive movements are really important. Palestine is a real genocide is happening in terms of the question of migration. People's lives are being made absolute hell, and it's affecting the whole of the working class. And like horribly inhumane things are being done. And other racism, disability, the disabling effects of capitalism is a really serious crisis. And the treatment of disabled people is something we should all care about, and people being able to live their lives to their full in all these ways. And I think what's been missing from the conversation, and Chris, we talked about like resistance politics, and I feel the same way about resistance politics, and that's not going to get us anywhere. But I think what is sometimes missed is that whilst the left has been, or huge parts of the left have been tailing progressive movements and adopting their slogans cynically in order to draw people in, that's not the whole left. It's just and so the Marxist left, or parts of it, do have an analysis of migration which relates it to the whole capitalist system. They do have analyses of disability, of race, and of Palestine, and of nationalism, and they don't fall into all of these sort of vulgar nationalist or sort of intersectional liberalism kind of points of view. They are able to articulate a more sophisticated critique, and that is actually really valuable, and should be incorporated into things. And I think it's very easy to look at these sort of easily co-optable analyses of problems we have, and condemn them, and then sort of from this position of aloofness be like, well, we don't, if anyone talks about gender, if anyone talks about race, if anyone talks about Israel-Palestine, it's all the same thing. Tucker Carlson talking about Israel-Palestine is the same as a Marxist analysis of the situation. So I think that's something important to bear in mind.
Or just briefly, I want to say something about the immigration issue, since obviously that's a signature issue of Trump's, and he's sort of proudly proclaiming mass deportation, etc. Well, the brutality of like anti-immigration state crackdown is obvious. What about the brutality of migration itself, like looked at as a global phenomenon, right? The mass displacement of people involves a great deal of brutality that we would would sort of be glossing over in silence if we only emphasize the brutality of the state with its deportation regime. Similarly, on the Israel-Palestine front, it's not wholly inconceivable that global capital will be like, you know what? The Zionist entity is a drag on global capitalism. It's a liability. You know, Israel, what they're doing is kind of a liability for what capitalism wants to do with the Middle East. It's not too far-fetched to say that progressive capitalism will say, you know, Israel, we're not going to deal with you the same way as we have up till now. It's not beyond the realm of possibility. So, yes, like these right-wing pundits, they have their ideas, but there's also more going on there. And even if we say, oh, public opinion in the United States is turning against Israel, there's nothing necessarily anti-capitalist about that whatsoever.
I would just say, I mean, I agree there's nothing anti-capitalist about being anti-Israel. Inherently, it's about how you articulate that, what your wider politics are and how it fits into that. And the same on migration. There are Marxists like Emmanuel Ness wrote a book recently on migration as a feature of imperialism, which in some way, that might sort of upset liberals who wanted to see migration as a wonderful thing, and obviously migration in itself can be a forced thing that happens to people and so on. But we can just do that. We can just have a socialist, Marxist critique of these things. It's as simple as that to me.
I'll just quickly say, I mean, I think something can be evil and worth opposing regardless of how it relates to capitalism.
So this is a question mainly for Chris, because it is in response to your, during the first, sort of talks before the questions, your final thing you said, which was that Zoomers today have been falling and becoming Stalinists again. And I'm wondering why you think that is, and of course I'm wondering if everyone else agrees on the panel. And not only why do you think that is, but are you not sure that, how sure are we that it's genuine? I always question that. It always seems a little bit just like they're cosplaying as a member of the USSR, and perhaps it is genuine, but it just seems so very bizarre. So that's sort of my question is, why is that, and how serious should we take them?
I mean, I was in some ways a soft Stalinist, I guess, in a small way, and it is interesting how that develops. And I was talking to some people about this earlier. I think there's an element of sort of delayed teenage rebellion of if capitalism and the establishment says the USSR was terrible and communists are evil and stuff, and then you react to that and say, well, you look at some things that were actually interesting about it, and there's plenty of propaganda around. I mean, there was 80 years of propaganda produced that you can read, and now there's new people writing things like Grover Fur and all of that. You can get pretty deep into it. I think in the UK there's a reaction in a kind of bureaucratic labour circles, so out of the Corbyn movement, against Trotskyists as sort of being perceived as sort of awkward and wreckers, and there was sort of some appropriation of Stalinist type, or at least like Soviet iconography, to say, we're going to get things done, whatever democracy says. We're not going to wait around for that, and it's obviously completely toxic and won't get us anywhere. And if I think it's going away, I don't think it's going to be a very significant thing.
I would just comment. I mean, I really don't don't know. Like, I have not seen this trend of mass pro-Stalin sentiment among Zoomers. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, or that there aren't people that take that view, but also, you know, people on the left take all sorts of views, some of them really dumb and some of them really good. So, you know, I mean, yeah, if you want to start a violent argument, just put two socialists in a room together alone. You know? So, in my experience, I mean, I know a lot of people on the left. None of them are pro-Stalin. I've definitely encountered people who have kind of Stalinist tendencies, and to me, it also strikes me as a bit of an immature kind of. It's like a stage. It's like, you know, when you're a teenager and you feel the need to rebel against your parents, even if they're like keeping you alive and giving you the car to use on the weekends. But this is like something you have to just go through a phase of maturity. I feel like that is what that is, to the extent that it even is a really big phenomenon. Again, not something I have personally encountered. It'd be great if we had some data. I don't know. Is there data that shows this? Do we have some kind of?
Well, I just have to say, it's representing Platypus, and we're on tons of campuses. It's everywhere. It really is. All the people who come to our reading groups have their friends are all Stalinists. They're in the ACP. They're Maoists. It's a big deal.
But then, I mean, you know, for instance, if you're talking about the Democratic Socialist of America, you know, which is, like it or not, you know, it is the largest socialist organization in the US. I mean, there's definitely people who have that kind of view there, but I think that would be a relatively marginal view there. So, I mean, I'm not saying that that's not the case, but I'm just saying it's difficult to really gauge, you know, and I think depending on who you're talking to, you're going to probably come up with a lot of different impressions. But I would agree, I think probably everyone here agrees that it's not good, you know, that's a very bad position, and I think, yeah, very unhelpful, as you were saying.
If I could kind of diagnose the symptom. You know, early Millennial Left, new SDS, but also the anti-war movement, would have, from certain standpoints, been seen as very much affected by Trotskyism. Meaning the ISO here in the United States, the SWP in the UK, you know, did have an outsized role in the war on terror, anti-war movement. And the DSA, of course, was started by Michael Harrington, who himself was a Trotskyist, who was himself a Shachtmanite Trotskyist. And so I do think that the failure of the Millennial Left calls forth this response. I think that the failure of the Millennial Left calls forth the neo-Stalinism against the quote-unquote Trotskyism of the millennials. And different aspects of the New Left have been recalled at different times in the last 20 years. So different phases of the New Left have come in and out of fashion in terms of how people would like to remember that history and what they think is useful about that history. So I think an early New Left standpoint, like a kind of early STS standpoint, had more currency, and now we've been much more in the thrall of a kind of a late New Left, you know, again, anti-imperialism, black power, second wave radical feminism, right? 70s is a little bit different, it gets a little bit complicated when you look at how that history is repeating itself, but you know, the New Left itself went through a kind of Stalinist phase in the 70s. And you know, it might be a little facile to do this, but it does seem like the Millennial and Zoomer Left is recapitulating a kind of 60s to 70s trajectory seen previously on the New Left, where the 60s was more open, less dogmatic, and then in the 70s there was a kind of eager embrace of dogmatic, like ML, Marxist-Leninism, in a way that was not the case in the 60s. And I think that something similar is happening. I think the millennials actually were open to an authentic reconsideration of the history of Marxism and socialism in a way that the Zoomers are much less patient with that and just want answers. They want like a positive vision. And that's why it's socialist construction, and no, we don't like critical theory. You know, that old Marxism is too negative. We need like positive socialist construction. You know, Stalin was way beyond Lenin, etc. Right? So, I do think that that's part of it, is the rejection of the millennials. And the degree to which the millennial left looked like it was too Trotskyist, then the answer is, hell yes, Stalinism.
Okay, we're gonna go,
This question is for Bronco, but also for the rest of the panelists as well. You sort of characterized the neo-Stalinism that exists but also doesn't exist, maybe, for you, as a sort of immaturity that needs to they need to grow out of. But as Chris just said, in some sense, the neo-Stalinism of the Zoomers is them getting serious after the failure of the Millennial Left. And so my question is, what would getting serious, what would maturing mean for the Zoomers? Like, where should they go? Is it the DSA? Because you did mention the DSA. Are we back to this question of like the DSAs where we all just need to go to as like a left unity kind of project? Yeah.
I mean, to answer the first part of the question, I think I hope that anyone who pursues a socialist politics has a fundamental belief in democracy. Democracy should be at the core of socialist politics. That's the, part of the idea is democratizing, it's extending democracy past just basic political rights and into things like the workplace and the economy more broadly. And I think even beyond just the principle, I think it really goes well. A liberal political system really goes well, and I think leads to abuse and all manner of other terrible outcomes. So I just fundamentally think it's a bad idea in many ways, on many levels. In terms of where people should go, the reason I say DSA, the DSA is the largest socialist organization in the country. I personally think that a kind of broad tent approach makes sense. But when I look at organizations out there, I think that DSA is the one that has, in my mind, had the most impact. But that's that's something that we can disagree on. I think the more important thing in this case is I think a rejection of kind of Stalinist authoritarian political systems is a really important thing for the left to do.
can we get Lon?
Yes, sure, go ahead. Hi. I had a number of questions that I wanted to ask. Many of them have been somewhat answered in the course of this discussion. And just on a personal level, I thought Professor Hartman, your comment at the very beginning about can the left today be an effective institutional form for this resentment or dissatisfaction that is clearly out there. I thought that was a really salient observation, so I just wanted to thank you for that. Anyway, that isn't the question I'm asking. The question I have is just piggybacking off of this neo-Stalinism discussion. And I don't actually know what Stalinism is, and I don't know what neo-Stalinism is. I know that Joseph Stalin was a person of some significance to the socialist movement, but I'm not sure what philosophical framework or set of substantive positions being a Stalinist entails, or why the current crop of Zoomer leftists who identify as Marxist-Leninists or as Maoists or whatever have you merits the term Stalinism. So my question is, when you all use that term, what is that a symbolic cipher for, and why is it a problem? Thank you.
Well, I think that touches on an important thing, which is that Stalinism has been used as a way to describe really sort of everything we don't like, and as a way to explain every historic failure. And that is a problem, and I think that's led to a failure to recognize how sort of parallel experiences have negatively affected the rest of the far left. So particularly the sort of bureaucratic form of the party seriously affects Trotskyist parties as well. And a particular sort of interpretation of the party of a new type as requiring ultra centralization, a kind of militarized party form, and a ban on factions and this kind of thing. It's a problem across the far left. And so I think I don't think anyone in this room is particularly tempted to do this, but I don't think we should just be alive to Stalinism. I think we should be alive to all the legacies of that period and how they affect our practice.
I must live in some sort of bubble because I didn't know that there was neo-Stalinism. So thank you for introducing me to that. So Stalinism, as it originated, was a term of critique from Trotskyists. Stalinism would have been the ultimate sectarian movement in terms of crushing all other sectarian, using the Soviet state to crush, destroy all other sectarian movements, especially Trotskyism. My most historical familiarity with the term is in the context of the US from the 1930s up through McCarthyism, and that was a Stalinist was just somebody who was considered an apologist for the Soviet Union, nothing more. It didn't mean anything other than probably a member of the Communist Party who was unwilling to criticize the Soviet Union. And so it's a pretty meaningless term in the context of the US, other than as something that the state worked to repress or that other leftist groups worked to diminish. I have no clue what neo-Stalinism means.
I mean, I think the way I was using it was, as to mean a police state, a repressive state that uses like state violence to put down dissent, has strict limits on freedom of speech, freedom of press, and other basic civil liberties. That's how I was using it. Maybe we were using it a different way.
I mean, in some ways, Stalinism isn't really anything. Meaning, I would define it as the liquidation of Marxism, as the adaptation to the continued capitalist world. And again, that raises the whole 20th century. Meaning, it's in many respects just the abandoning of a perspective on socialism in the core metropolitan countries. And the modeling of the struggle for socialism on the building up of the Soviet Union and Communist China and other countries like Cuba, Vietnam, and North Korea. Now, right, so on the one hand, Stalinism is a kind of pejorative term, and as such, it's problematic. We just call everything we don't like Stalinist. On the other hand, it's also this kind of strange, scary, attractive thing, right? Like, look at what they say about the Soviet Union, or look at what they say about Communist China. And maybe, if they're wrong about everything else, maybe they're wrong about that too. The ruling class or the dominant ideology. So I think that there's also the danger of like Stalinism is like big, bad, scary thing. Whereas I think Stalinism is more sad than anything else. In other words, when looking at the history of the Soviet Union or looking at the history of Communist China, I don't think that we should be impressed by how scary it is and then try to flip that into how wonderful it is, but rather accepting how sad it is. Right? The experience of the Soviet Union, the experience of Communist China, mostly sad, mostly sad. But again, when wanting to be a socialist in a country like the United States, I can understand why people would want to see concretely, okay, what's the positive alternative? What is the model? I would just say we'd be hard pressed to imagine that somehow the model for socialism in the United States could be anything like the Soviet Union or China.
The good news is, if we're debating the existence of Stalinism, maybe the left is back.
Okay, this is gonna have to be the last one. Let's go, Spencer.
I want to pick up on this question of Marx as returning for the 21st century, and I think there was a question in the front about that, and pick up on maybe the spirit of the panel in terms of thinking centuries. We haven't really mentioned, we mentioned Marx, but we don't mention the 19th century, right? And really, I think it's very difficult for, I think it's difficult in general for young people, but society to face how old, I think Andrew said forever in the sense of ever since capitalism. And with the 19th century, the other question is the 18th, the bourgeois revolution and the emergence of socialism, and how in the 19th century, arguably for Marx, but even for many liberals, the proletarianization of the question of the working class, the social question, was viewed as one of the transition pangs to another form of society, right? And how we've lost sight of that. And I don't mean to pick on you, Andrew, but this is where I would really trouble this issue of like being on the side of the working class, right? Rather than on the side of historical freedom, of the overcoming of the proletarian condition, right? Overcoming the entire question of class society. And how this kind of fixation, which I think the question of Stalinism represents, with the 20th century, really means a kind of fateful lowering of horizons, where the question of Stalinism is really the left as a vanguard of capitalism, or as the chief apologist for capitalism. I think Chris was getting at some of this by talking about progressivism. And it leads me to think about how we might think about like a historical accumulation process, right? I think this issue of like Trump taking up the discontents of the 80s, the 90s to 2010s, the Republican discontents, the Democrat discontents, via Ross Perot, et cetera, that entire process could result in talking about the return of the party of Lincoln and a debate over and a preoccupation with 1776, which Trump is going to preside over the celebration of next year. So the issue of tariffs and all of this, like we're returning to the 19th century, right? And so the right has taken up this question in a profoundly incoherent way of the accumulation of history to the present moment in a way that I think the left has more of an impasse and really can't get over its return to the 20th century and the compounded defeats that we inherit.
Is there a question? So no Marxist would be worth salt if they didn't want the dissolution of class society. And also if we didn't think in grandiose terms. I tend to discount the notion that we're living through all these various different capitalisms, precisely because I tend to think in sort of like longer historical terms in the way in which you're describing. But it's correct me if I'm wrong, anybody, please, but I think it's really difficult to organize people around some notion that we're going to transition out of capitalism. Given that it pervades almost every aspect of our lives right now, and given that the previous historical form, call it feudalism or whatever you want to call it, lasted millennia. So I think you're entirely right, but I don't know what that does for us. And I think that organizing around working class power may or may not get us quicker to the end of capitalism, or it will improve. And I'm rarely in a situation where I'm accused of being a reformist. But there are better ways to live than now, and I think it requires us to improve the power of people who work for a living.
Maybe we can, just because I would like us to maybe give our closing remarks and, to maybe rephrase this as a question so others feel they can answer. Is capitalism still the transitional society? Do we still believe that, right? Do we still believe that it's a transitional mode of life that will end, and that there is a task for the socialist left to bring about that end? And if we do think that, or we don't think that, what does it mean? And maybe that's a way for us to kind of wrap up this discussion.
I'm just happy to go first, and then I'll be done. But I will not drop the mic. So just building on what I just said, I guess I'll return to Marx, sorry. But Marx to me was at his most profound when he was both arguing for a sort of longue durée transition out of capitalism, and also how the only way to conceptualize that would happen was through organizing the working class for a better existence in the here and now, for shorter working days, for more freedom at the workplace, for more just freedom in general, and that the two coincided. That sort of, to me, the brilliance of the entire edifice of the theory is that you can work to improve the lives of people now while thinking about transitioning beyond capitalism. That's kind of like what motivates me to read Marx and think about a socialist movement of the future.
I'll keep it short. I think that human beings have been on this earth for a very long time. We have organized ourselves and our societies in many different ways, as Andrew alluded to. Capitalism itself is not an eternal thing. We can date it to a certain time. There are countless different ways that we can organize and reorganize society if we so choose, and if we can obviously overcome the obstacles to do so. Now, in terms of the role the left plays in that, I don't know if the left is going to be the one that ends up doing that, but I do think the left has an important role in helping to make that come about, however that ends up happening. Perhaps it'll have a leading role, perhaps it'll have a supporting role, I don't know, but I think that's our task.
You could sorry, I thought it was done, but you could, just building on that, you could say, if the left has a role in ending capitalism, what comes after? I hope everyone in this room thinks what comes after will be better. If the left doesn't have a role in it, it could be worse.
I'd like to kind of echo that. I think one of the legacies of the 20th century that we need to overcome is determinism. And I think I wouldn't say this to a room of people that I was trying to convince to be Marxist, but if you read Lenin, he does introduce a degree of determinism, in my view, to Marxism, that is greater than we can defend, and it might have been appropriate for the time. It might have been a rhetorical strategy, but I think it was firmly believed. I think we need to overcome that. We will then be without a sort of guiding hope. We need to find that somewhere else. And as we know, what comes after could be worse, and Marx says that, you know, it could be the alternative is a common ruin of the contending classes. So I wish I could tell you exactly what we need to find our hope in, but I think part of it is turning to the people that are engaged in the left, outside of this room as well, and that was something I was trying to say earlier. Because there are a lot of people that for some reason or another see themselves as fighting against capitalism and for socialism, and I think it's important to engage with those people, and I think those people, as well as the people here, will be the people to find a path to, you know, a solution to that problem.
All right, so Spencer, since you mentioned 1776 and the fact that Trump will be presiding over the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, I sort of dread it a little bit because it means that the left is going to have to be very anti-1776 as a result. We've already had a preview of this with the 1619 project, and you know, I always like to point out Dean Baquet, the editor of the New York Times, very explicitly said we have to make the transition of anti-Trumpism from Russia to race, and that's what the intention of the 1619 project was. It was part of the anti-Trump strategy at the time. So, you know, apart from the fact that it was the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in the American colonies, 1618, in 2019. So I will invoke someone who we know, who has spoken at Platypus conventions before, Conrad Hamilton, from Capital Comrades, ex-Sublation Socialists. He said that Trump tearing up the global capitalist order means the end of the Columbian era. The end of the Columbian era. Right? It's the end of the era of European colonization of the Western Hemisphere. So there is that notion. There is the notion that the end of capitalism will mean the undoing of what back in my time in 1992 was called, this is the quincentenary of the Columbian discovery, 500 years of racism, sexism, and did they say homophobia? They definitely said settler colonialism, slavery, etc. As if these things didn't exist before 1492. So I will also recall, unfortunately, because of the neo-Stalinism, I guess it was the millennials, but I feel like it's still with us with the Zoomers. Read Settlers. Read Settlers. Read Settlers. That meme, except it wasn't just a meme. It was an actual injunction, and people actually read it. You know, Jay Sakai's late Maoist or post-Maoist text from the 80s, from right before my time, which when I was in college, I was like, oh, thank God. Like, I thought that Bill Clinton represented. And you know, certainly the dawning of the 21st century would mean that no one's ever going to read that book again, right? So in 1992, I was like, oh, yeah, there was this book called Settlers, and thank God no one will ever read that again. Unfortunately not. Unfortunately not. So the end of class society, the kind of utopian horizon of socialism, capitalism as a transitional state, I think that people are thinking about the end of capitalism, but they're not really thinking about socialism, or their model for socialism is pre-capitalism. The model for socialism is pre-capitalism. And then I would be remiss if I didn't mention the Jody Dean, Yanis Varoufakis neo-feudalism, right? The neo-techno-feudalism or techno-neo-feudalism. My interpretation of which is, well, we're not entering into techno-feudalism. In some ways, capitalism was always techno-feudalism. Wage slavery, right? It was always the road to serfdom, to quote Hayek. So again, when we're thinking about the scary future, or even when we're thinking about a utopian horizon for the future, we might actually be thinking about the past or really about the present. Meaning maybe we're not waiting for techno-feudalism to come along and be worse than capitalism. Maybe it's already been techno-feudalism, and that's how we should understand capitalism. And maybe it's not going to look like that. Maybe that was already neoliberalism. Maybe neoliberalism was techno-feudalism, and maybe what's coming is something else. Not better, not worse, different. Because we have to struggle for socialism in the new form of capitalism, good, bad, and different.
Thank you to the panelists. To have dinner and drinks and keep talking, we'll be at Avenue Tap and Kitchen at 3407 North Paulina Avenue. 3407 North Paulina Avenue. If you want to get involved with Platypus at the University of Chicago,